Welcome to NewYorkBIOs Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020 bringing you fireside chats with leaders across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Jason Johnson, partner at Moses and Singer in the healthcare privacy and cybersecurity and intellectual property practice groups, as well as Lisa Murtha, partner of Moses and Singer's healthcare group.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jennifer Hawks Bland, and I'm the CEO at New York Bio. We are very excited that you're here for another edition of our virtual breakfast series. This morning, we a special thank you to Moses and Singer and MS Strategic Solutions for sponsoring this month's series of breakfast. And we actually have two experts from both of those organizations today. We're going to talk with Lisa and Jason about diversity in clinical trials and federal regulations that you need to be thinking about. And then I think we'll also look at diversity sort of writ large, right, across our ecosystem and within patients and the importance of it. With that, housekeeping as always, please, I know you'll have questions for Lisa and Jason, so put those in the chat or the Q&A box, and Derek and I will get to those as we go through the course of our conversation. With that, I'll kick it over to Derek to start us off. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. And I always look forward to basically digging into big topics, right? And this is a big one. We've talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion in our industry for ages, and it hits on everything that we do. It hits on starting companies, it hits on clinical trials. It really hits on what does the face of discovery and development look like for the foreseeable future. So Lisa, Jason, it is wonderful to have you here. I think to kick off, why don't we get a little bit of background on both of you, and then we'll dig in.
I'm happy to start. So my name is Jason Johnson. I'm a partner Moses and Singer in the healthcare and data privacy, cybersecurity, and IP groups. Believe it or not, I did not want to be a lawyer early in my life. So I actually started out in research. So I was pre-med and undergrad, and then I did benchtop research for about 6 years. So I started out down in North Carolina in the Research Triangle Park area where I'm from, doing HIV vaccine research, and then leukemia research for a couple of different labs down there, which was great. And so actually I was involved in clinical studies in both of those labs. So from a very early start, I was involved in clinical research, and the HIV vaccine study in particular was a worldwide study. And part of the reason it was a worldwide study is that they were looking for specific types of populations outside of just like gay men in the United States. So I think I've been dealing with diversity in clinical research since the mid 90s. I then went to Eli Lilly for a couple of years and did high throughput screening. And then after that is when I decided I wanted to be a lawyer. Before I went to law school, I actually worked for a clinical research organization as a clinical research associate and a monitor. And so part of the responsibility was helping actually draft the protocol inclusion-exclusion criteria. Was part of the responsibilities that I had. So again, going to the diversity inclusion part, I was lucky enough to work with a couple of different pharma companies that were actually thinking about this in the late 90s. Right. And particularly, we're going to get into this, I think, a little bit more, but really, who is your patient? Right. Versus like, let's just get the data. And I think that's going to be a big theme for a lot of this diversity inclusion is focusing on your patient. So after that, I did go to law school, and then I was in the I decided it was time to grow up and get a real I got a real career. So made my mom happy. So but yeah, I did. So before I came to Moses, I've been in Moses 6.5 years. I was actually a patent litigator. So with my science background, I went the patent route, and I did a lot of litigations in the Hatch-Waxman space. So pharma and generic, mainly on the pharma side. And when the biologic revolution kind of came around, that line got a little fuzzy, as I think everyone knows. And so, but yeah, since I've been in Moses 6.5 years, been doing a lot of work in the healthcare arena with startup companies, digital health companies, and things like that. Doing a lot of clinical research related work with academic medical centers, and things like that. So that's me. I'll give it over to Lisa now.
Awesome. Go for it, Lisa.
Thanks, Derek and Jason. I'm just absolutely thrilled to be a part of this morning retreat into diversity and research. My name is Lisa Murtha. I joined Moses and Singer and MS Strategic Solutions 2 years ago. It's been a very fast 2 years. I started my career out many years ago as a healthcare regulatory lawyer. And interestingly enough, I've spent as much time being either compliance professional or consultant in the healthcare regulatory space as I have as a practicing lawyer. And why that's relevant to today's talk is back in the mid 1990s, I took the job as the first chief compliance officer at Penn during a very interesting time in Penn's history as it was going through the Jesse Gelsinger case. For those of you who aren't aware of that, it was a situation where a young man was enrolled in a gene therapy study. And unfortunately, he passed away during his participation in the study. And it raised a whole host of issues around should children even be enrolled in research studies, what level of consent and assent is appropriate in that space. There was both government investigation as well as private litigation associated with the matter. And as a result, one of my main jobs was to essentially help the organization develop and implement a research compliance program. And among the issues that we talked about was this whole issue of children in research, other populations besides the traditional, white adults being enrolled in research studies and things such as that. And over the course of my career, I also worked as a vice president for compliance, privacy, and internal audit for a large children's hospital in the Mid-Atlantic area. Since then have been practicing primarily in the research compliance space. So again, thank you so much to Jennifer and Derek for having me today.
Okay, so why don't we kick this off a little bit with let's give a little bit of background, right? I think it's very easy to say that for a long time, most of our clinical trials and most of the research that we've gotten on human patients, I don't really like to use the word human subjects, but most of the work that we've seen on patients has been on white males. Okay, so how and why did we get there in the first place?
Yeah, and I can kick this off, and I think Lisa has a specific example of something she worked on, but I think in general, right, there's a lot of barriers to participation from diverse groups of populations when it comes to access to the facilities and enrollment. And again, we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about that, but I think the disparity is really around those types of issues. In particular, right? So, I think there's now lots of studies that show that you look at the population of a particular disease or disease state, and very typically, the representative population is not, a high level participant in the actual research. And so I think there has been now recently sort of a recognition and a real focus on, okay, why is it that we're not getting the folks that have this disease in, and how can we make sure that those folks are actually participants in these studies? And truthfully, going back to my example with the HIV vaccine study, in my other experience, I think a lot of times it was just you needed to get the data, right, to be able to get the drug approved, and you just wanted the data. And so I think the focus for a long time was really just getting through the FDA hurdle. Instead of, let's think about who our population is. I mean, look, we see all the time, phase 4, post clinical trial studies where, additions to the label are added, black box warnings are added. And the reason that happens is because during the main clinical study, those populations, particularly with the comorbidities that these study population, the people that have these conditions really haven't been studied. And I think, I think that is now being recognized as something that, should be done. Pharma in particular has, put some high level guidelines out there, but, even the funding agencies and the FDA are really focused on this now. But just to take one step back, right? And I think Lisa's example on from her UPenn days is important, is, when we say diversity, right? What does diversity mean exactly?
Yeah.
And I think it's also really important to think about that concept, right? So it's not just, we need to have, gender equality, right? It's not just we need to have equality in ethnicities. And I think that COVID in particular really kind of highlighted some of these issues. So for example, children, right?
Yeah.
It's important to study in children, and I think Pfizer and their vaccine was a pretty good example, right? Because
Yeah.
it ended up with the 3 doses. And so
Yeah.
I think when we talk about diversity, it's important to think about all types of populations, even including prisoners, right? And so it's really, the focus should be on who are we trying to treat and where are those people, and how do we make sure we get those people represented into the actual study, is from a diversity perspective. But I know, Lisa, you in particular had like a actual real world example of where you did like some research on this topic in particular.
I do actually, but let's keep in mind one of the interesting dynamics that we face when researchers get funded, particularly by the government, but also by commercial sponsors, is that it's all about enroll as many patients as you can, as quickly as you can. Enrollment. So inevitably, researchers sometimes just devolve into getting those patients in that are the easiest to get in. Patients who speak English, patients, who understand what research really is and that it's not the standard of care. Patients that, have a higher level appreciation for what they might get out of a research study, right? So that, I think, is one of the contributing factors that our sponsors sometimes do us a disservice in some of the timeframes associated with enrollment. So that's certainly one thing that we can address at some point going forward. But there are also a number of other reasons why I think diverse populations often don't come into research studies. One, of course, has to do with the basic cultural differences. And again, this, misunderstanding that, research is viewed as true experimentation, that you're a guinea pig, that there's no clinical benefit for you in participating in a research study, which for those of us who work in research know that that's really not supposed to be the case. Mm-hmm. There should be some inherent benefit at some point for participation in most studies, maybe not phase 1s, but otherwise. Also linguistic differences, speaking different languages and not having necessarily the informed consents translated into all of the most commonly spoken languages. One of the things Jason and I were talking about a little while ago is the fact that in West Philadelphia, where I spent a good deal of my career, the primary language spoken is in fact Mandarin, not what you would expect, Hispanic or Hispanic related languages. As a result, though, you would think that most of the informed consents for research would be, of course, translated into Mandarin, which was not the case. Almost always there was a Spanish version, but not necessarily versions in other languages, which I found to be a real brain teaser. But those linguistic differences are very compelling. We can talk more about how to fix that going forward later in the talk. Financial constraints and job-related constraints are a big deal. Oftentimes, if someone is a shift worker or an hourly worker, they won't have the time or the privilege of being able to leave to go get a clinical trial treatment or whatever it may be, or to even take part in some of the monitoring that may have to be done for a study. Logistical challenges as well, to the extent that people don't have access to cars or even public transportation can be very problematic. So some studies going forward may have to consider in the budget providing transportation to and from the clinical site where they're going to get their research treatments. just a general lack of studies that focus on minority populations. And as Jason said, the common diseases that exist in those minority populations, and really doing a deep dive into that, taking into account the comorbidities that you often see in some of those populations, whether it's high blood pressure, diabetes, whatever the case may be. That goes to overall study design and protocol development and making sure that all those things are covered. And let's not forget sort of an overwhelming level of distrust, right? I mean, we can't forget about Tuskegee study, the Havasupai Indian study, and some of the others where members of some of these diverse populations were in fact literally used in a certain sense as test subjects and not as
very much so.
So I think that plays into it as well.
Okay, so to do a little bit of table setting though, I want to deal with what I'll call kind of the financial elephant in the room, right? Which is as soon as you submit an IND to the FDA, the clock is ticking on the net present value of that therapeutic, right? Mm-hmm. So for a number of years, right? Number one, Wall Street judged everyone on when you get your clinical trials are just the amount of time it takes before you launch, and the shorter those are from a financial standpoint, the better. Mm-hmm. And then as you layer in the growth of CROs and how they got really, really big, they were all incentivized to fill trials, right? That the goal and the incentive was, can you hit enrollment and how fast can you do that, right? So, I think that probably led to a lot of where we are now in terms of, if the goal is just to get there quickly, you don't think about who you're putting in your trial. So how do we, I don't want to say combat that, but how do you change that ethos? Because so many of these are
right?
How do you balance that? I mean, these are public companies, right? So in some senses, they have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize the value of their therapies. So how do we get to a point where our industry is more thoughtful about who's in the trial and what that means versus the very strict financial, it's worth more to us if it gets done quickly?
So I think part of this is going to be, unfortunately, and this started down this pathway, regulations and laws, right? Because, and this is coming out with, the 21st Century Cures Act and the new FDA regulations that are talking about requirements about diversity in the patient population, requiring statistical analyses, both plan up front and then ongoing. So I think what is going to have to happen is the message is going to have to be from clinical researchers and then from the investment community, is that they have to understand now that there is legal regulatory hurdle that has to be overcome. And so companies must address this issue. And so, you have to acknowledge that as an investor or, as an individual that's looking at this. I mean, look, I hate throwing regulation and law on top of stuff like this, but otherwise I don't think you change the culture. Because look, as a clinical research associate, I can tell you that when we were looking at multiple different studies, right, to enroll, there were sites that always got picked because they always enrolled a ton of people. And they weren't really diverse in their population, but they enrolled a ton of people. And so those folks just continue to do all the clinical research as part of that. And, and again, I saw this as, from my own experience. And so I think you have to have the legal regulatory framework in place first, which then allows companies to think about going to and partnering with other entities in different parts of the US, both urban and rural, right? I think, there's a huge opportunity in the urban area when you're talking about, Lisa's example in West Philadelphia, New York City, where we are, right? I mean, so I think the dynamic has to change there. And again, I know like pharma has put out guidelines to talk about how important diversity in research is. And, they have guidelines out there that really support and, are trying to push these companies to do that. But I kind of think that's where we start, right? Which is there's an obligation to do this. And now let's take this for what it's worth. And companies now have to think about, okay, well, I'm not going to do my study at these 5 sites.
Right. And to sort of add on to what Jason said, it kind of started out in 1993 where NIH came out with its sort of proclamation that diversity in research was important. And now recently, the Office of Inspector General for Health and Human Services has put on its work plan that the OIG is going to do a study of how NIH has handled diversity in research studies for those funded through that agency. So that is, I think, going to be hopefully a key driver going forward for both the government as well as commercial sponsors to focus more on diversity. Because honestly, all it takes is one big, splashy settlement in the newspaper for organizations to take more of a focus on that particular issue that gave rise to the big scandal and turn things around. So it seems like the industry is now creeping in that direction a bit, which is a good thing.
So can we talk a little bit about maybe how COVID may have accelerated, right? At least in the public consciousness, and then the practical. So I want to do twofold. I want to talk a little bit about how COVID impacted diversity in clinical trials and the public consciousness around this, right? And then I also want us to think about, like Jason had mentioned, rural, urban. Clearly, New York is urban, but as anyone who's tried to make it cross town during rush hour knows, even within a small area like Manhattan, right? It could distance in time can still be a barrier to participation and how we address
Are you close to the site? Well, as the crow flies, yes, but I can't get
exactly,
there.
yes. If I had a jetpack, I could get there really quick.
Technically, yeah.
Right. So I'm going to talk about the transportation thing first, just because I was recently at a conference where one of the ride sharing companies had done a study, and what they had looked at from a health, and this was not about clinical research per se, but this is about health access, right?
Yeah.
They were talking about how before they came in, right, with their sort of ride sharing, that the average time to get anywhere within the city, and I can't remember which city it was like, say, 45 minutes, right? Buses and whatever, walking. Okay.
Yeah.
With their like ride share app, they not only expanded sort of the reach of where people could get access, but they reduced the time significantly. So it was somewhere in like the 5 to 10 to 15-minute range, which is a lot more convenient. So I think, and this was not a big urban center, right? So I think, but it had public transportation like buses, which, obviously can be unreliable and stuff like that. But I think that's kind of what we have to start thinking about, is like outside the box types of access like that. Because transportation is a huge thing, right? Giving patients reimbursement for that as part of the clinical research should also be part of what goes into this, because ultimately you want to give people the opportunity to participate if you can. We were working with a health system in a state recently on a similar issue, right? Which is, they had a main campus where the hospital was, where most of the people in that area were part of the study, but they had all these community centers like all over the state that they wanted to include in this. And so this is exactly what we were talking about, is like, how do we make sure that those sort of clinics and other sites are participants, number one, but number two, how do we make sure that people can get there? Right. And transportation and payment for transportation was one thing for incentivizing. So I think we have to think outside the box a little bit about that, because ultimately you do have to get people from point A to point B. And with the advent of Uber and Lyft and all these other like apps and everything, I think there is an opportunity to sort of decrease that sort of transportation issue. But that's going to take, coordination as part of this. The other thing that we talked about was after hours, right? So most studies require procedures to occur at a certain time or time frame, right? And so most hospitals and most clinics are like 8 to 5, 9 to 4, whatever it is, right? And so the other thing is yeah, right. So the other thing is creating opportunities for people to arrive after hours, so to speak, to participate in these clinical studies. And I know there's been a lot of resistance to that, because that requires them paying like nurses and additional staff and stuff like that. But I think, again, going back to Lisa's point, these folks have jobs, right? And they can't not show up to their job because A, they might get fired, or B, they might get paid. And that's not really, advantageous for them.
Yeah.
So, shifting when the study occurs, I think, is also important. And when you talk about COVID, right? COVID bringing some of these in, I think COVID in a way forced diversity when you look at the types of populations that were getting COVID during this time frame, and the type of data and information that was being gathered from some of the treatments from early on. In New York City in particular, New York City Health and Hospitals, right? It's a city hospital. And so they see very diverse populations, and they were hit significantly hard with, a lot of different patients from a lot of different, ethnicities and backgrounds. And they were participating in some, most of the clinical studies that were ongoing, right? Which I think, was probably atypical for some of this, right? To be able to see that that height of diversity and population as part of these studies. But I think ultimately what you got was, a look into like, well, okay, well, how do we make sure we can structure this from a volume perspective, right? So you got translating for consent forms, you got translators that were doing calls and call-ins because no one wanted to go into the rooms, right? So really the infrastructure to create diversity in research was forced upon these folks because they had to do it at that time, right, at a high volume. And I think that type of infrastructure and that type of experience is only going to translate further down the road and be able to continue this for, studies where it isn't like time sensitive, so to speak, right, where it's life or death. So I think that's, to me, is where COVID really kind of changed this, is that it really forced people to create systems and put procedures in place to deal with this diversity, and to really think about, well, how do we make sure that these patients can actually participate, right? So if we've got, Hispanic folks who want to participate, we need translators, right? We need translated consent forms. Why don't we have that already? Like, we need to get that before we do the study or whatever. So I mean, that's at least what I saw.
Yeah, and also one of the things that we saw in those studies was both the FDA's new allowances for telehealth and the use of telehealth to be able to provide research-related visits as well as FDA's allowances for off-site monitoring, whether it's having, portable monitors that patients can take with them, and then, they link back to something that the study team monitors, whatever it may be. That, I think, went a long way, to Jason's point, to allowing more diverse populations than ever to participate in studies. Because again, it was more on the patient's timetable versus the study team's timetable.
Yeah, I think one of the important things that you're hitting on here is that clinical trials are very often a precursor to care, right? It's basically a predictive wave where if you only have a certain type of person in your clinical trial, you are very likely to treat that patient more and more. So I think about things like cell therapies, right, where they certainly aren't present in every hospital. They're in the major kind of big city hospitals. So if you're so here's a question: in the future, how do we position ourselves now so that a child in Montana can get a a CAR T cell therapy, which is what they're going to need to treat their cancer, right? How do you see us moving to the place where we actually solve enough problems, either starting with clinical trials or not, that we can actually make that a reality? Because that's really, ultimately, that's really what we're talking about here. It's not just diversity in the clinical arena; it's really diversity in care.
So, I mean, look, I think this is a really tough question, because there's obviously a financial aspect to this, right? And where I think you saw some of this is in the COVID vaccine arena, right? So the COVID vaccines had to be stored at really low temperatures, which meant that the facilities had to have access to a certain type of freezer or storage to be able to even house the vaccine to be able to give it out. And I think, in a lot of, cell therapy and gene therapy, types of clinical studies, you're going to have the same type of resource issue. So I think there has to be investment up front in making sure that these types of resources for that type of, operational requirements are part of budgets and are handled, right? Because just because a facility doesn't have a freezer, it doesn't mean they shouldn't be able to participate. So I think that's sort of the first and foremost, is that these issues about actual operational things need to be thought about upfront, and budgeted for. Because once a hospital has, in theory, the type of freezer, then it should be fine for any type of study going forward that needs that type of thing. But that's a hard one, right? Because that's just an investment that needs to take place locally. Otherwise, I mean, I don't know. Another thing from my CRO days is that there were facilities that were built specifically for clinical trials that were strategically placed,
Right.
Certain areas within, like, close to different urban areas or close to rural areas. And so it did require some amount of transportation, but it wasn't like, hospital A at the bottom of the state, and that's the only place you could go. And then that was it, right? They placed their sort of clinical centers all over the place. So I think that's another, to be honest with you, opportunity, is to create these sort of clinical trial centers where multiple different studies operate out of. And I think that, to me, is like a collaboration on the pharma side, right? Because they would all, I would assume, benefit from having a facility like that where they can get different types of populations and people involved. But I think that's a really tough question, Derek, overall, because it's always going to come back down to sort of money and resources. And look, we all know that rural hospitals in general struggle already, right? And there's these, like, sort of medical deserts that exist in particularly in the Midwest and out West. And so, I mean, this is just a care treatment issue. But I think if you start bringing in sort of the clinical aspect to this, and as Lisa mentioned with telehealth and the expansion of telehealth, I think that creates a lot more opportunities for folks to get involved and to get care as part of the clinical research part of it.
Right. Yeah, so that sounds good. Oh, go ahead, Lisa.
Go ahead. No, you go, Jennifer.
I was just going to ask, so how do you incentivize? So we've talked about, and I think there was a question about incentivizing, right, investigators and recruiting trial patients. How do you also incentivize those caregivers? You just talked about in rural hospitals are already, in some cases, underwater financially. They don't have enough providers to provide the care to the patients they do have. How do you convince providers to also add, right, clinical trials, potentially running clinical trials and having patients?
Yeah, this is an age-old question, right? How do you get community hospital physicians jazzed up about doing research? And, that really comes down to, in some respects, leadership in those hospitals, creating avenues for those clinicians to do research in a way that advantages them. So, for example, some of our clients have instituted something called research privileges and research RVUs. Within their payment structure, their comp structure, such that they would give these clinicians a certain amount of release time to be able to focus on clinical research studies and providing patients access to clinical trials, and at the same time not in any way decreasing their RVU productivity. So that has been a pretty successful method of getting more talented and interested clinician scientists involved in research in community hospital settings. So that's, again, one example. But it boils down to really having, whether it's a pharma study that's sponsored, having whoever's developing the protocol, or even for investigator-initiated studies, people thinking through, what is this disease we're studying? Who is really affected by this disease? And to that extent, how do we find the patient populations that we need to have a data set ultimately that has true integrity, that is truly representative of the whole, right? Because what is research? The research is gathering generalizable data. The pure definition of generalizable is it stretches across the whole, if you will. So, focusing on that, and then creating partnerships between hospitals, to include them as, whether it's subcontractors to studies or performance sites or whatever the designation is. But, having them focus on looking at the DRGs that they typically see admitted to their hospitals. What are patients in that community typically presenting with? And does that hospital see enough patients in diverse areas that have the disease that needs to be studied? These are things that whomever is developing the protocol really needs to start doing to make sure that you, A, can meet your enrollment criteria in a meaningful way, and B, ensure diversity in the populations you're studying.
Yeah.
Can I add to that?
You sure can.
So, and I want to go to sort of the point you were making a little bit earlier, Derek, which is care. I think the mentality has to change around this, which is that, and I've heard this from, physicians that are involved in clinical research. So pharma company comes in and they do a clinical study with a drug, right? Patients do well, clinical study ends, right? They don't see that drug ever again, right? It's like the continuity of care goes away. So I think part of the idea for this is that if a physician enrolls a patient in a clinical research study, the drug works for the patient, right? There are mechanisms regulatorily where the patient can continue to get this drug, right? It doesn't have to stop just because they've reached week 6 of the protocol, right? So they can continue to receive that drug. And I think there's a lot of, disconnect and frustration there with physicians where they find something new, they get the patient in the study, it's working for them, and then the study ends, and that's it, right? And so I think going to your point, Derek, I think the philosophy and mentality has to change, that clinical research is part of the care, right? And so if a patient is seeing results from a new drug, there's no reason that patient has to just stop, right? There are mechanisms in place to allow that patient to continue. And I think that would also incentivize physicians to want to participate in these studies, because it's not only that they get access to new drugs, but they're getting access to new care for their patients to actually care for them. So I think that, that conversation, I don't know if it's being had, but it needs to be had sort of between the pharma and the site level, because I know that's a frustration that I've heard, from actual treating physicians.
Okay, so I want to bring up a point that you said before, because Lisa just said the magic word, and you said this a while ago, where you're talking about inclusion and exclusion criteria, right? You're talking about the actual document that says, these are the people that you're going to recruit, right? It's an upstream event. This document is created before the trial even starts, but basically it dictates who's going to be in your trial. So how much smarter are we getting around how to write inclusion exclusion criteria, and how much incentive is there to actually make sure that these documents results in an inclusive trial experience? Is there anything either handed down from the NIH or the FDA or HHS writ large that is going to affect that upstream?
So go ahead if you want to, Lisa.
Go.
So I think there's, at both the NIH and the FDA level, right, there are specific requirements, right? So the NIH, for example, has designated certain subgroups. The U.S. population is like health disparity populations, right? Okay. And so what the NIH is requiring as part of sort of the protocols that are going around, for the studies that they're funding, is that you have to have some sort of discussion mechanism about how you're going to address the health disparity populations as part of the study that you're participating in. So it's actually part of the requirement for your disclosures, right? Same thing with the 21st Century Cures Act, right? So anything that goes on clinicaltrials.gov, they have to actually submit results of analysis of sex and gender, race and ethnicity as part of the clinicaltrials.gov requirements, right? So from a regulatory perspective on the NIH side, right, then that's there. So it's forcing you up front to think about all these different subpopulations. But I think that's what you should be doing anyway, going back to the idea that, the patient that you treat, you need to understand who they are and what they come to the table with. So again, for example, right, if you're studying a disease where, it's the population is like mainly African American, right? And you can figure out from this population, like, is the main comorbidity diabetes, right? And then as part of like your clinical research, you're going to be looking at, does this drug affect, sugar, insulin, right? So I think that's what at least the NIH stuff is trying to force people to think about, right? Which is, who are these groups? I had to include them. I had to think about who I'm actually trying to treat. And the same thing for the FDA, right? So the FDA has very similar like recommendations along these lines, but it also includes requirements sort of along the way of the different phases to reevaluate, right? Have you found the right diversity in your populations? What are you seeing trend wise? How do we revise the inclusion exclusion criteria to deal with sort of this interim data analysis that we've done to look at diversity in the patient population? So the FDA really requires you to think about this at the various stages, evaluate it, and then change or adapt your protocol and your inclusion and exclusion criteria to address that. Right. And so the FDA is specifically looking for that, in your responses to the FDA and to your disclosures to the FDA as part of the different phases of the trial to move on to the next one. So again, I hate throwing like the law and regulation on top of this stuff, but there are certainly now some sort of requirements that are in there that are forcing requiring these companies to think about those types of diversity issues in the patient population.
Yeah, and as these things become more public through the use of clinicaltrials.gov, and now with the FDA having strict reporting requirements about the diversity element of a study and its inclusion and exclusion criteria, hopefully that public nature of that information will spur on more sponsors to ensure that their inclusion and exclusion criteria include the right populations. And again, that their budgets provide the funding to be able to draw in those types of people along the way. That's going to go, I think, a long way to bringing more to the forefront this whole issue of diversity in research. And, even if it's, something like, competitive forces between companies, who's going to get the better patient populations to enroll, or whether it's embarrassing an organization because they haven't done what they need to do. But, using the public nature of clinicaltrials.gov hopefully can be an element of bringing this issue more publicity and more focus that it really needs.
Do you think companies will actually do you think the embarrassment issue is actually, does that have any teeth? Like, where's the penalty if it doesn't happen? Right. That's the big question. I think the benefits are pretty, well, they're straightforward from a theoretical point of view, right? It's very hard to find. I don't know if it's very hard to find the actual data here, but where are the teeth if companies don't do it?
So I got to be honest. I think we're at a really weird place right now in the US, at least when it comes to trust issues around medications to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think in the past, right, companies would have approached this issue differently than I think they do nowadays. I know when what was it, Vioxx had the black box warning that came out, like there was a huge like marketing campaign. I still remember the commercials that talked about how we're safe and effective and all this stuff. And I think like J&J was putting out commercials about their like talc powder, and baby powder and stuff like that, really, trying to like persuade the patient, the population, like we're safe, we're effective. I think in today's environment, right, in looking at the COVID vaccines in particular, I think it's much harder for companies to figure out when they actually have to say something. And so the incentives seem to be a little bit different than they used to be. I get the sense that companies aren't quite as concerned about certain things as they were in the past, based on sort of the current environment. I may be wrong about that, but I think that sort of current cultural political environment is a weird one to kind of add onto this dynamic right now. But I think certainly financial incentives always work, right? And I think you can see Elon Musk's Twitter takeover as a good example of that as things evolve, right? Which is he understands now that he owns Twitter, that advertisers pay his bills. So, you know, he actually has to play ball in certain respects. And so I think in this case, it's really investors and the FDA, right? If the I think with the current administration with the FDA, I think they're going to be aggressive with diversity requirements. And I think that this is where you're going to see the FDA go back to companies and say, we're not going to approve your drug because you did not, we know your subpopulation is African-American women in their 30s.
Mhm.
You have less than 1% of patients in your clinical study that are African-American women in their 30s. You got to go find like us, like, you know, another like representative sample before we approve you. I think that's what's going to happen. I think that's what's going to create the incentives, is that the regulatory scheme is going to come in and say, nope, you got to go back and do more of this. Otherwise, I don't right now, I don't see anything else kind of driving this, to be quite
So
honest.
clearly that is, from a pharma perspective, sort of worst case scenario, right? You get to the AdCom and
Yeah.
then, right, and then they're like, no, sorry, you have to go back and re-enroll a different population for your trial. Like no one wants to be in that position. So how does a sponsor think about that now, right? What steps do they need to be taking today if they're looking, you know, down the road a few years for the final approval?
Yeah, again, I think I don't think this is hard, right? You have a drug, right? You want to treat people with that drug. You can do research to figure out who the people are that generally have that disease, right? And then there are statisticians that can say, okay, here's how you get a representative population. And then you go find those people. I mean, I don't think, I mean, that to me, like I think it is straightforward and simple. I think where you get into trouble is what I mentioned before, which is it's hard to go find new partners, right? If you can go to this place in Nashville, Tennessee and get 100 people enrolled, it's just simpler, because this comes down to money, right? It's a cost. Yeah. And so I think that's the hard part, is that you can come up with, I think, pretty easily like what the plan should be. But finding the partners and finding the right places to go do this is harder because that network doesn't exist, right? I think that clinical research has been, as Lisa mentioned, it's been embedded. It's been the same places, the same folks,
for sure.
And because it was quick. And so I think that's where this has to change, is that there has to be more partnerships. Pharma has to start thinking about more partnerships with like different types of hospitals and different types of communities that they maybe haven't been in yet, that have like certain types of patient populations. But I think this also goes to starting, because look, I think there's a lot of patient advocacy groups that are now popping up that are building their own databases of individuals that have certain types of diseases and disease states. And I think these guys are going to be great partners going forward, because they're going to help companies figure out who the people are and where to go. And they're going to have like readily available clinical research participants as part of this. So I think that's the other avenue of this, is like looking to partner with existing like organizations and groups. They're already working with patients in these areas and populations, so you can start building partnerships there too, which I think will naturally outflow into partnerships with like the local hospitals and community centers. But I think that to me is the challenge. The challenge is not creating the right protocol and the statistical plan, right? The challenge is like finding the sites to do that, and I think that's just going to be more like legwork than it has in the past.
I'm really glad you brought up the patient groups thing. I mean, we've, in our entire journey with this webinar, one of the things that has been over and over again is that, interacting with patients and patient groups and patient advocates and going to the source of who knows the most about the patients keeps coming back as not only a viable thing to do, but an important thing to do. And I just think it's going to keep getting more important. Okay, Lisa, jump in. Go ahead. I cut you off.
No, and it just goes to your point, Derek, that a lot of organizations now, whether they're hospitals, academic institutions, or standalone research organizations, have a diversity office, right? I mean, one of the smartest things that happened at the Children's Hospital where I worked for several years was the fact that researchers started to partner with the VP of diversity in our organization, because that individual had done the research about, the different populations of people people that could come and work in our organization, as well as the different types of populations of patients that we saw. And so she literally was able to identify, oh, here is a Spanish weekly newsletter that many of our employees and our patients read every single day. You should advertise your study here. So working with people like that, I mean, some of the information is so readily available. All it takes is to ask the questions.
Yep, I completely agree. We keep finding that, actually asking patients and asking them where they are is much more important than doing it the old way. And Jason, you nailed it. We have this entrenched, kind of incumbent clinical research structure that we hope, I don't want to say we hope breaks down, but we hope changes it. I think one of the things that's important is that, we have to realize that not all drugs are the same, right? We have, a tendency to think both from a PR perspective and to write policy around quote unquote therapeutics. But there's a very big difference between a 5,000 patient cardiology study and a rare disease study where you need 8 kids, right? And I think one of the things that's going to be really important is that, integrated conversation about, these are the people that we need, and there's only 8 of them. But if we don't get to these 8 kids as quick as we can, if that enrollment drags on, the other 50 kids, 100 kids that are going to have this disease that we could theoretically treat, that becomes, how do we get these kids access to potentially what could be a really important drug for them, right? So, ultimately, again, this is my long question for the day, right? So ultimately, we have to think about what it means for patients and how we think about access and how we get people into our trials.
Well, one thing I'll mention is that, and we see this a lot, right? So there are a lot of KOIs, key opinion leaders, that are the treating physicians in a lot of these, rare diseases, and diseases where you have, pretty limited patient population. And so I think, at least in my personal experience, when I've seen companies engage those folks, it's typically created sort of a better clinical research environment because, these people are treating the patients. So they have a lot of just institutional knowledge about what it means to be a patient with this disease and how the company should be thinking about structuring not only the research, but how they should be thinking about side effects and other ways to look at sort of the patient when they're on this study, right? Because they know these patients. So I think involving key opinion leaders is something that I've seen a lot of, I guess, smaller biotechs do. I don't know if like the bigger pharmas are doing the same thing in my experience, but I know like the smaller biotechs are doing that but it also, the nice thing about that is it creates an end for a patient population, because by and large, these people want to be involved in these clinical research studies because they don't typically have many other options available. And so if there's something that's coming along that could help them, so be it. I had a childhood friend who had melanoma, and he went through multiple different clinical studies and actually in rural North Carolina. And he was always willing to participate. And he had a couple of studies worked really well for him, some didn't, but he had a really good physician that was an advocate for him and had been able to become a KOI in melanoma, and like a lot of clinical research companies and pharma companies reached out to him whenever there were studies coming on. So but it's that relationship, right, that was really important for that physician, and that physician wanted to provide this to his patients. So I think key opinion leaders and folks that are kind of on the front lines need to be involved up front too, I think, to try to help address some of these issues.
Yeah, and I do think that there is a unique, and as we've talked about, increased visibility role for patient advocacy organizations, right? We're even seeing some of them being the NDA holders, right? As we move forward, right? So things have shifted. I think it's driven partially by the easier way to connect patients to each other, right? Through social media and through other, methods, internet methods that we've set up. But I also think that it just becomes an easier way for patients to also control their own data and how they participate in studies. And I think that that's something that we really need to think about.
I think that's true. And I think that, you know, they're with Web3 in particular, right? There's sort of a lot of buzz about portability, data portability, but obviously data portability has been a thing since HIPAA came around, right? So, you know, it's just never been like, there's never been like a good solution to that. I know a lot of folks are working on that, but I do think that is also a bit of a barrier, right? When, you know, you are being seen at one location facility and you want to enter a clinical trial, perhaps it's at another facility. That data portability is sometimes a barrier. And I do think, you know, hopefully that'll get addressed sooner rather than later as well, as sort of the interoperability and the ability to sort of like do the transfer of patient data. Because I mean, obviously that's all valuable and necessary information for that person to participate in. And I do think it can be a barrier sometimes.
Yeah.
And
Right.
some of
So-
this too boils down to pure education. You know, there are a number of opportunities in a clinical experience to perform some very light and not overt education, but very effective education. You know, how many times have we sat in the waiting room waiting for an MRI or some doctor's appointment or whatever the case may be? More and more, particularly the large academic institutions now have TVs in these waiting rooms where they have little vignettes about research. What is research? How can you participate in research? Here's what it does for you. And I just can't emphasize more the value of that, because, you know, that gets to the heart of making people appreciate and understand not only what's available to them, but how they can participate as well.
Okay, so we've mentioned both Web3 and Elon Musk. I will tell you, if you can work an NFT into your final answer, everyone gets a free cup of coffee. So what are we looking at in terms, okay, in the future, right? What's actually coming down the pipe from either a regulatory or a legal standpoint? What are the things that are actually going to shape this challenge for the future? Because we, you know, I think we've hit on all of the motivations of industry, of patients, of investors. I think we basically laid out the challenge there. But what are the things from a regulatory structure that are really going to shape what the future looks like?
I mean, go ahead, Lisa. Sorry.
This is very quick. I think one of the things we'll need to look for is next year's report from the OIG on NIH, how good a job NIH has done about including diversity parameters in their funded studies, and how well the research sites in turn have complied with those requirements. Because if that result is not a good one, that's going to no doubt induce some change, whether it's by way of regulation or guidance or what have you. Right. So that certainly will be one thing that will prompt things to come. Jason?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think the FDA with their draft guidance that came out earlier this year on diversity in research is going to be a driving force on the FDA side from that perspective. So I think that's where you're going to see a lot of push, at least from my personal opinion.
Yeah.
All right. Well, go ahead, Jennifer.
No, go ahead, Derek.
I was going to say, we have the last couple minutes. Where are we, and are we going to tackle this? Where are we in 5 years? Do you think the stuff that we have moving now is actually going to move the needle in terms of what our patient populations look like and what access and care looks like 5 years from now?
The $6 million.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I think COVID, for better or for worse, put these issues at the forefront. And I think there are a lot of structures in place that didn't exist pre-COVID to really enhance and support diversity in research. And I think I'm seeing at least a lot more of these partnerships develop between hospital systems and pharma and hospital in these various areas. And I think the advent of telemedicine and sort of televisits is going to help. Look, the FTC, I didn't know NFTs, but FTC, right, is investing a lot of money, right, in like broadband access and high-speed internet access in sort of these, like, you know, digital deserts, so to speak. And so I think that's going to be a tremendous help to reach a lot of folks and to create, I think, flexibility in study visits and collection of data, along with the advent of all these new like digital tools of collection, right? I think, the at-home stuff, there's a wealth of data and information that these companies can collect. And I'm seeing sort of a shift to that because it's cheaper for them. Right. It's much easier to have the patients collect the data on their own and to monitor through televisits than it is to have them come into an office, meet with a study admin and meet with the doctor and have somebody, fill out information and forms and all this stuff. It's just so much more efficient. It's so much cheaper to do it electronically. So I think that, all of this ecosystem is going to increase the diversity. At least that's what I think.
And we can't forget the use of social media, right? I've seen more and more protocols come across my desk that specifically speak to the use of social media as a means of, getting the right types of patients into a study. And, it's such a powerful thing that we have access to now that never existed 20 years ago. So again, to the extent that researchers are thinking more outside the box and using tools like social media and portable devices and things like that, the better it's going to be. So we're definitely on our way. Whether we're there in 5 years, I'm not so sure. Maybe
I gave an ambitious timeline. I did.
Thank you both so much for participating today. I think this topic is it's very important, but B, it was interesting, and it's important for us to have these conversations. I hope everyone will join us next Tuesday morning. Same time, same place. We have a special political edition on election day. So thank you so much, Lisa and Jason and the audience. We'll see you next week.